So welcome, colleagues, Yasmine Martin, Executive Director of MiraMartin, Ricardo Matter, Managing Director of JLL, Hernán Passalacqua, Executive Director of FitzRoy. So thank you for joining us this morning. Many of you know these people. They have many years in the industry, many years covering the countries where they are based, and even more so, all of them are, until before the crisis, they were traveling throughout the region. In the case of Yasmine, she was in Peru. Case of Ricardo in Brazil. In the case of Hernán in Chile. And of course, with a lot of knowledge in the region in general. So welcome, thank you for joining us. Thank you. So the idea is going to be to share our knowledge and experience, and from the time that the crisis arrived, and especially what's occurring now, and to see how we could understand what we can expect for the next few months or the next time. In principle, I'd like to have a brief screenshot of the situation in the markets where you are at, and we'll start off with Yasmine. Thank you so much. Thanks to Arturo, and I hope to see you in SAHIC live. You were one of the first ones to reinvent SAHIC virtually, and on March 15th, we're still on the sanitary emergency that ends on September 7th, rather, and the quarantine is over now, and there's only a focalized quarantine in certain regions of the country. Of course, the numbers are not looking good. The World Bank says that the GDP will be reduced by 12%. We've seen that the tourism, 4.4 million tourists, reduced from 70 to 80% in the domestic market, and last year 45 million trips, going to be divided into 5 million trips. So, and the deficit or the reduction is 50%. So, in spite of this interesting information to share, as we've seen, the government here in Peru started with a lockdown relatively early, but the measures taken were not respected by the community and have generated almost the same index as the contagion in Brazil. People have not listened to the measures, and there's a lot of informality. 70% is still an informal population. So this has advantages and disadvantages. Some of them have not been working in the last 4 decades in the formal sector, so they're going to have to reinvent themselves. So in the next months, we have a deficiency in the sanitary infrastructure, road infrastructure, and this is important to generate and to drive internal tourism. There was a study, market study, that was just completed, one with focus on Sector A, and the other one in Generation X, or the baby boomers, which was very interesting, Arturo. For your information, more than 60% of these markets are planning to travel in the next 5 months, in spite of all the uncertainty, in spite of the fact that there's no clarity and how you get to the region. The Lima airport just opened on July 15th for national domestic flights. It's not yet decided when international flights will open. They say August 15th, however, there is a great incognito here, or a great question mark in this, rather. And the hotel sector needs not to target those who are unemployed, but those who are employed. There was many people who didn't lose their jobs, but were working throughout this whole lockdown and making their savings, and they desire right now to, of course, visit the usual places: Cusco, Machu Picchu, Arequipa, Valle de Colca, Valle de Volcanes, and that sector A. So they want to go to the beaches and the places where they could get on their own car and drive. They feel safe in there because they feel that they can control their environment and their road trip in terms of health and sanitation. That's the preface to share with you. So I think international is going to take a while. Lima is very corporate. So if you ask me, is it worth to open one of the 2,000 room hotels that are in the pipeline? Of course, the answer is no. The regions are going to have to benefit from internal tourism. So I think that the ones that are following the STR reports are covering this anomaly where Lima has had an occupancy that's relatively interesting despite the pandemic. It was around of the 70 or 80 hotels that were open, 3, 4, and 5 stars. They received people who were repatriated, and the self-quarantine groups from the mining sector. So the rest of the country, 90% were closed. So now it's going to switch. The hotels in the regions could take advantage of the situation and move forward. So we have to bootstrap the costs. We have to communicate with the franchise, the brand. Yes, yes, we'll talk about this. Thank you so much. Ricardo, in Brazil, how is this looking? What's it looking like right now?
El panorama es dramático.
Well, it's dramatic in Brazil.
La industria está cerrada.
The industry is
como en todos los
closed,
países.
like in every country.
Estímase que un 80%
The estimate is
de los hoteles de
80%
Brasil
of the hotels in Brazil are
en
closed
principios de abril. Y
in the
ahora
beginning of April, and now
ya algunos hoteles están reabriendo.
some hotels are reopening. There's a reopening process, a very simple one.
Ya están
But some hotels are
ayer
going back.
empezó las vacaciones
Yesterday,
de
the
invierno
vacations
de Brasil,
started in Brazil.
Entonces, algunos
So,
hoteles de
some hotels
resorts del hacer
and resorts
están reabriendo porque,
are reopening,
especialmente los que son
and
cerca de los
especially
grandes
the ones that
mercados
are
emisores
close
como São
to
Paulo,
the
Río,
big
Brasília.
markets, São
Entonces,
Paulo,
hay una
Rio,
retomada
Brasilia.
muy tímida,
So there's a shy comeback,
la
but
situación sigue
the situation
crítica.
continues to be critical.
Brasil, diferente de Perú, tiene un
Different from
mercado
Peru,
interno muy
Brazil
fuerte.
has a very strong internal market. Tourism
La hotelería no
and
depende del turismo
hotels don't
externo.
depend on external
La
tourism.
participación de
The
turistas
participation of
internacionales
international tourists
viajando en Brasil
traveling
es un 10%
in Brazil is 10% of the
Tenemos
total.
6 millones
We have
de
6
visitantes
million
internacionales y hay
foreign
60 millones
visitors, and there were 60 million
viajando
Brazilians traveling domestically.
Y bueno,
And
claro,
so it's clear,
son
and
los que se sintieron más seguros en retornar
they felt
a viajar
safer in
y
coming
se
back.
hospedar en hoteles. Pero también
So
dentro de este mercado de 60
within this
millones hay una
market of
gran
60
mayoría
million,
de gente
there is
viajando
a majority
a
of
trabajo.
people who are
Y la economía, las empresas
working or
están
traveling for
cerradas,
work, and most companies are closed.
no solo porque
Even
los negocios
not just because the businesses
están
are
parados, básicamente, o
closed, basically, or halted,
muy flacos,
and
por cuestión de
running
seguridad.
pretty much on
Yo,
empty,
por ejemplo, mi
but
empresa no me
because they are
permite
insurance.
viajar.
My company, for
Solamente
example,
con una
we're not
autorización
allowed
muy especial
to travel except under very strict
en nuestra casa matriz.
order by the
Entonces,
CEO or the headquarters.
tiene este impacto,
So
pero
there's an
también hay una
impact, but
compensación.
also
Brasil
there is a
también es un
compensation.
gran
Brazil is
mercado
also a
generador
great
de turistas
generator
para
of
afuera, para
tourists
visitantes
abroad,
fuera de Brasil.
outside Brazil.
Y esta gente por
And these
hoy está
people
prohibida de viajar. No
are
podemos
banned
ir a
from
Europa,
traveling.
no
We
podemos
can't go
ir
to Europe. We can't
a
go
Estados Unidos
to the United
de
States
forma general.
in
Entonces,
general
mucha
terms.
gente va a quedar
So
en
many
los
people
próximos
are going to
meses en
be
Brasil
in the next few
y
months have
también
to stay
van a
in Brazil.
hospedar en hoteles. Entonces, la
And
situación
so the
esta
situation
vez comparativa con
is,
nuestros vecinos
comparatively
un poco
speaking, with
mejor,
our neighbor
pero sigue siendo
neighbors is
dramático.
somewhat better, but still dramatic. Ricardo, What about the quarantine in Brazil, in São Paulo
No hay una
especially? Well, there
política
is
de la
no
federación. La política
policy
fue
by the
básicamente
federation.
de
The
las provincias,
policy was in the
y cada
provinces,
una en un momento.
each at a certain time.
El epicentro de la
The
pandemia en Brasil
epicenter
fue
in Brazil
la provincia de São Paulo, la
was the
ciudad de São
province
Paulo,
of São Paulo, the city of São
y
Paulo,
que
and
aparentemente, pelo menos la ciudad, la
apparently at
capital,
least the
ya
capital
está
city
llegando en el topo
is already reaching
y
its peak,
activando los hospitales de
and
campaña
they are in
y
the campaign
la
hospitals,
disminución
and
de la tasa de ocupación
there's a reduction in
las
the
terapias
occupancy
intensivas,
in
y
terms of
entonces
intensive therapies.
aparentemente estamos ya
So
controlando,
we are apparently
y
controlling
otros estados no.
this,
La
and other
verdad que
states are not.
tardaron mucho a
So
empezar, otras
it's
provincias,
taken a long
y
time
ahora
to
están
start in
empezando.
other
Entonces
provinces,
es
and
muy
it's just starting
difícil
now. So it's
decir la
very
situación de
difficult
Brasil
to
como un
understand the
todo,
situation in
pero
Brazil.
certamente
But
los principales centros ya
exactly, the
estamos
main
viendo
centers are already
una estabilización de los números de
seeing a
casos.
stability of the number of cases.
Relativamente los números son muy
Relatively
bajos, porque la
speaking, the
población de
numbers are
Brasil es
very
de
low,
210
and
millones, la provincia de
so
São Paulo son 43
the province of
millones
Sao
de
Paulo
personas.
is 43
Entonces los
million
números
people,
son
and the numbers
menos de
are
0.5% de infectados
less than
y un
0.5%
5 y un
infected,
5% de
and
de
5% of
óbitos.
those
Entonces es muy
are positive.
muy
So
relativo.
it's
Yo
very
soy muy
relative.
positivo, un optimista, creo en la vacuna.
So
La vacuna
I'm
está por vir,
optimistic.
y yo
I
creo que
believe that the
ya en
vaccine is coming,
2021 la situación
and
va a empezar. Y como decimos
it's
ayer
going to
en
start, as we
nuestra
said
charla
yesterday in
preliminar,
our talk.
la memoria es corta
The
de la gente.
people's improvement is coming soon. Hernán, what do you think from Chile? What's the standpoint there? We know that Ricardo mentioned something that will be everywhere, how the media and the social networks distribute the information. And we've never reported any diseased, and any news, but how many people infected and how many recovered, and this has been fatal. So this replicates where there's news. There's incredible news from Chile, but what is the situation there?
Arturo, gracias por la invitación y saludo al resto de los panelistas.
Thanks for the invitation. The
The
situation is similar to the rest of the countries in the world. The quarantines are almost general, total confinement, and there is a crisis. There's a lot of unemployment in Chile, over 1 million lost jobs already, and it goes to May. So the only activity that hasn't stopped is mining, which is going to stop now because there's been some contagion. There's 10 million people right now, half the population, that should be at home. And the fines have been raised so that people behave. So there's a state has promised some help and contributions in kind and in money, and there's a lot of informality in Chile. There's a lot of confinement, similar to other countries, a lot of poverty, and in the last 2 weeks it's been raining very hard, and there's other problems. So we have the problem of floods now. So this is very important information in the local authorities, and the numbers are improving, and there were 4,000 infected per day and 400 deaths per day. That's very, very bad. Now, the per capita number, we're 5th in the world with most infected. The death rate has been low in Chile. The situation is dramatic in the families. It's complex. It's very complex for the families. You mentioned a point that's key, which is the inequality and poverty, and many destinations have had an influence because of the infection, and this is evidence that we don't know the progress. There's still yet a lot to be done, and as you mentioned with Yasmine, 70% of informality, so people live in conditions that are not the best to avoid this infection, and you need to find your money, your income, so it's difficult. And as you said, with the low mortality, it's happened because the infected people are young, and there's a lot of countries with low mortality. So in the United States, the numbers were different. The infected people were in a lower age range. In the United States, mortality is 5%, and the world average is 7%, and Chile's is 2%. So different from Chile and other countries. There's been more tests done. There's over a million tests. So that's different from Argentina. So, as we said, there's an image that we need to have of the region for the future, because if you compare the image of Australia and New Zealand, they've been very strong, and with all the news on the Wall Street Journal, etc., and Bloomberg, etc., and other clients in South America, it's very homogeneous in many places. The European and American markets are going to take a long time. Yes. Okay, we could do it during the discussion. We can start with Uruguay. They're more or less in the same situation as Australia and New Zealand. But before that, there's a situation in this crisis that's generated the, like most of you said, immediate paralysis, the closing of hotels. And this is an important situation. Let's assume that things come back to normal quickly. But what's the work on controlling to survive? So some are open, some are not. In every case, we've adjusted costs, and even those that are closed, how do you view the possibility for them to go back to be in the market? The situation is they're closed down, so this reopening is going to need an effort, and we don't know if everyone is going to be able to do this. Certainly, Arturo. In the hotels, like I said, there's 80% of the hotels are closed, and of course, losing money, but there's another 20% that are open, and they're still losing money as well. And this is on account of how to lose less money. So this is the flow of cash, and that's key. And this is already, or the hotels are already adjusting. There is no financing, no debt from the private banks. The governments are doing this, are managing the situation. So in Brazil, as in Argentina, and other countries, we have this situation with the hotels, and we have a fragmented property in ownership, and it's very difficult to get to these owners to understand the situation where they have to contribute.
Ya tuvimos anuncios acá en Brasil de algunos hoteles más en el sector de resorts, pequeños hoteles familiares,
hotels and small boutique or family hotels that already announced that they can't operate again because there's no conditions for them to do so. They lived with their normal revenue and surviving and contributing in the capex, And
ahora es
now
imposible,
it's
no
impossible.
tiene
They
caja
don't have
para
a
pagar
way
a los
to
empleados. Entonces va a ser un
to
cambio
pay their employees. So it's
muy
going to be
grande
a very big
en la oferta
change
de hoteles
of
en
the
nuestra región,
offering of
exactamente en
hotels
Brasil.
in our region. Yes, it's similar, Arturo, here in Peru. Unfortunately, the government wasn't giving importance to tourism, and we, after so many days, some packages are coming out for the tourism sector, not just the hotels, but also the travel agencies, tour operators, restaurants. There's 3 or 4 months without any cash flow. So what measures were there? Of course, communicating, we have to talk at least with the banks, have to talk about the brands, we have to talk to the franchisees and the operators, because the government, unfortunately, in the case of Peru, has not given the importance to this. So it's like having an asset manager trying to see together what can be done and what cannot. Unfortunately, the reality is going to be that some will not be able to survive the next 12 months only with internal tourism. Some will have to reinvent themselves and will work location. That's very important. The ones who have done that and who can digitalize some processes. That's important, because then you have that social distancing. There's a norm out today in Peru. Restaurants could reopen only with 40% of their capacity. So 40% to survive is very hard. And there are opportunities, yes, but the negative news, speaking with some friends of mine, we said, try to look at the positive side. They are hitting with negative news, Yasmine, in December, January, February. So in Latin America or other countries, they are in another cycle. So it's very important to see how we can talk, how the countries together, neighboring countries, can work together to streamline the feeling of if you travel. For example, airports of Bogota, Santiago, Sao Paulo work together and are in the right measures to have the new currency. It's not the Bitcoin, it's safety and destination. So we have to work together to work with the private sector, or those that don't have the ideas and the inputs for the tourism sector very clear, because they can generate these jobs, and with the same speed of unemployment, they have to recover and recreate jobs. Not everyone have changed their train of thought. Let me add, in regard to Arturo's question, here in Santiago, especially in Santiago, in Chile, the hotel sector has acted very quickly, reaching an agreement with the Ministry of Health. There's more than 4,000 rooms that are occupied. And there's people with COVID symptoms or have relatives with symptoms, and they're in a comfortable place in a 5-star hotel room with 4 meals a day. And the state is paying for this. So there is a benefit for the community. And there's people who are more vulnerable, but there is an additional revenue. So there's a part of the community solution. So undoubtedly, the most international destinations, the European and other markets, Santiago has more capacity. There's more leisure places, and they're going to have an important halt. I'm concerned about what could happen there. And if you have the market that's received in Chile, it's the Brazilian market, and the changes in Brazil have had or have depreciated by 60% versus the dollar. So for Brazilians, it'll be more expensive to come to Chile than it was in the boom of 2015 to 2019. So in that sense, to achieve Brazilians and Argentinians coming, because There's also a devaluation in Argentina. It's hard. Argentina and Brazil undoubtedly have an advantage that if there was a travel bubble, people from the region could attend. Chileans, Peruvians could attend. So,
Sí, no, complementar a la
Ricardo,
situación
you
de
wanted
los
to mention
hoteles,
something. Yes,
preguntaste
about the situation
la
in
cuestión de los
hotels.
costos y
You
todo.
asked
Yo
about
creo que
costs,
en
etc.
general,
I think that
los
in general
hoteles,
terms,
especialmente
and
los manejados por las cadenas
especially
hoteleras
those
internacionales y
handled by
nacionales,
the
fueron
national and
muy
international
proactivas
chains, were very proactive,
y agieron muy
and
rápido en reducir los
they
costos,
are reducing
en
their
tomar la
costs very
decisión
quickly
de
and making
cerrar los
decisions
hoteles en
to
el momento cierto.
take
Y
or to
obvio
close the
un
hotels.
ajuste muy
And I
grande
see a very big
en la
adjustment
estructura operativa
in
de los
the
hoteles.
operating structure of the
Y ahora
hotels.
que ya estamos
And
hablando de la
now that we're
retomada y
talking
algunos hoteles
about
abriendo, yo creo que es una
reopening,
oportunidad
it's an opportunity.
increíble
It's an
para
incredible
ajustar de
opportunity
una vez por
to
todas
adjust
el costo
once and for
operativo
all
de
the
muchos
operating
hoteles,
cost
que
of many hotels.
es
That
el problema de los propietarios con las
is the
cadenas,
issue
siempre los
with the owners
costos
and the chains,
generan,
cost and cost and
generan
cost. This generates
ingresos
revenue
captando
with
hóspedes por sus sistemas, de todo, por sus
capital,
canales
with their systems and their channels
distribución,
and
pero
distribution
hay
channels, but
muchos costos.
there's a lot of
Entonces yo
costs
creo que
there.
es una
So I
oportunidad
think it's an
tremenda
opportunity,
para hacer un
tremendous
ajuste,
opportunity to make an
ya que
adjustment
la cuestión
because
del promedio de diaria va a ser muy complicado cambiar.
the
La
average
tendencia,
travel will be
desafortunadamente,
difficult
que
to
los
change the
hoteles
trend right now.
bajan los precios,
Hotels are lowering
que eso para mí
prices, and to
no es
me,
correcto, pero
that's
va a haber mucha
correct. It's
presión
not the right thing to do.
de
But
la
there's going to
demanda
be a lot of
para
pressure
bajar
from the
las
demand
diarias,
to
y
lower
entonces
these.
hay
So
que cortar los costos, hay que
we have to
ajustar. La
cut
gente
in
va a se
costs. We have
acostumbrar
to
más
adjust.
con menos servicio,
People are going to have to
si no
adjust with
tiene
less
room
services,
service
or if
24
they don't have
horas,
24-hour room
concierge,
service
cosas
or
así,
concierge and these
o
kinds of things.
limitado, porque
It's all
esta es
going
la
to be limited.
situación. Si
That's the
estamos hablando
situation.
de una
If you're
nuevo
talking
normal,
about the new
para la
normal,
hotelería,
well,
debe ser
this is
un
what it's going to
nuevo
be for the
normal,
hotel sector.
costos más reducidos.
Lower costs and reduction in services. It's a good point. We were saying this yesterday, that some have come into this. It would be a great idea not to go back and even to do some fine-tuning, trying to come into a reality that's going to be different. It's not going to be black or white, but controlling costs. And you mentioned a key point, which is the lower rates, where unfortunately that's where it's going to go. And with lower rates, we know that everything else can be impacted.
Para concluir, tenemos ahora también un incremento de costos, que es toda esta cuestión de higiene, de todo, de salubridad que Yasmine estaba comentando. Esto va a incrementar los costos de los hoteles. Todos estos nuevos procedimientos de higiene, de limpieza,
hygiene, cleanliness,
están anunciando con paseos muy fuertes, con grandes centros hospitalarios mundiales,
with
empresas de
hospitals
limpieza,
and cleaning companies.
Esto va a ser más un incremento de costos.
This is going to be an increase
no va a
in
ser
the cost.
repasado para la diaria. Entonces, es más un motivo para cortar los otros costos.
For having other costs. Yasmine, you wanted to mention something? Yes, as Ricardo mentioned, for him to travel is more complicated. The tour operators in Europe, they are more adventurous, and it's their complication, their issue. They have health insurance and travel insurance. They are excluding any COVID issues. So we need to renegotiate. And that's very important to see with third parties how this corporate can go back, because they're doing what we're doing on Zoom. So travelers, corporate travelers between Santiago, Lima, Bogota, Lima, as we need to reinvent ourselves, the companies also need to reinvent themselves. It's going to be very interesting to see today, in 3 years, when there's a vaccine, things are going to readjust. But in the meantime, in these cases in Peru, for example, every 2 weeks, you are forced to have a quick COVID test done on your staff and to be in contact with the who are in contact with the public, but that's great. But what if on the 16th the person gets infected? So there's also some legal implications, and there's a lot of uncertainty. So it's very important that the governments, as Hernán mentioned, society, the trade unions or guilds are working. Here in Peru, I've never seen them so together closely, but the sector itself can't progress. So it's joint effort with the public sector coming in and to advance. I think regional tourism is very important, but there's something we need to touch upon, which is airplanes. How important are interregional flights? There's flights from Bogota to Cusco, very successful, and there were never any flights from Sao Paulo to Cusco. It's always through Lima. So we have to see. I don't know what information you would have on LACTA, Hernán, but it's very important for Peru to have this access to the other regional countries. The air bridge is very important. Let me add something, Jazz, about this. The most critical topic, apart from what we mentioned, in the moment that the tourism operators are living, is air connectivity. So in the last 20 years, there's been good players like Avianca, TACA, Copa, LATAM, and other operators, and there is air competition or airline competition. And we've had a good period in terms of air safety. Don't forget several accidents in the 80s and 90s that affected the image of the region heavily. In the last 20 years, we've been very safe, having good service, great airports, with concessions and operators like the fantastic airport of Bogota, Montevideo, Santiago. So there's been a spectacular window that's opened in the last 20 years. So we see that our region is, in a way, very fragile. And to know what the governments are going to do to support via subordinate debt or any other means where the investment bank agrees, but Lufthansa or anyone from the European Union or Asian to understand the bailouts from the United States. All the airlines understand that these are strategies not just for tourism, but also for passenger transportation, cargo, international trade. So this is box number one in the critical path of keeping success in the region. That's fundamental. And I see that there's two main airlines, Avianca and LATAM. So they're negotiating their liabilities, and undoubtedly they can operate, but they're going to operate with an installed capacity where I see a drop in those special routes, like you said, Jazz, Bogota, Cusco. They're going to be stopped for a while. Yeah. So probably we're going to have higher rates because that overture that ended last year with low-cost airlines, that was over for a while. So what the CEO of Boeing and Airbus says, and people from IATA, the recovery will be low. So I think that there's an opportunity in the region to concentrate on inter-regional travel, which is basically 3/4 of all trips, 3/4. Travel bubbles, Peru, Argentina, Chile, Peru, Brazil, Argentina, they've always had a very strong commercial relationship. That's the future, to have trust and to, like Jess said, it's key to work in between these countries. Yes. We had people here from different sectors, and we had people from the aviation sector, of course.
Arturo, hoy Aeroméxico anunció Chapter 11.
Aeromexico also announced this yesterday. Yes, that's right. So the topic is that it's one thing about the help from the governments, and some commented, well, isn't there another way to get into Chapter 11? Well, everything with the idea to reinforce the negotiation. The topic is that the companies that are receiving some bailouts. It's 8.5 billion, which is in euro, of course. Even if they receive that bailout, the airlines in Europe are starting to fly. And the issue is the reconstitution of trust, the rebuilding of trust of the travelers and the airlines. So booking is open for June 5th. So, and they test it and they begin to book, and they don't have the minimum level of bookings. They cancel and say, okay, this is going to go for July 12th. And there is a lot of breaking of mutual trust, which is tremendous, because travelers say, well, they changed it for another date. Okay, what we had in the information of this hard data analysis and bookings and cancellations, travelers the second time, well, they will change their decision to travel. That reconstruction or rebuilding of trust, the company can fill the minimum necessary, at least, to have one flight, and they are encouraged. And then they could say, wait a minute, it's difficult, this topic is difficult, and that's why some people say it's going to take a while. But I come back to what Yasmine said about this study of 25 to 35-year-old people. This is very encouraging. That's a small sample, very small sample in Uruguay, 3.5 million of inhabitants and a little more visitors. Uruguay has had the possibility, they were never in quarantine, and they've had the possibility through Sao Paulo to travel to many European destinations, and some like New Zealand. Everyone, the young people that had a European passport, tried to travel, and they did, to find an opportunity, not in order to repatriate, but these were people from South America who had a European passport, and in the younger ages. So this is absolutely true, that as soon as they can go up on their planes, they're going to do it. So we've seen this with a weekly flight that goes to Sao Paulo. There is no place, and people are going to leave to Europe mainly. Now, you mentioned, Hernán, the damage to the image of our countries, and that this is going to be a negative effect for a quick recovery. How do you view this, and how do you view this work in general? Has it been weak by the institutions, private institutions? Even in some countries like Brazil, Ricardo was mentioning that many of the players didn't even know each other. That's incredible. How can they work? Because this is going to be a joint public-private effort, and with the different destinations in the region working to recompose that. You said this yesterday. Hernán, how do you view this effort? Well, undoubtedly it's not easy. Never been. And there was never an attempt to integrate the region. But like Bill Gates said in April, under this crossroads, we are in the middle of Second World War, where Churchill won the first battle. And we are now in 1944. We're in the middle of war. And when we get out of this, then we will have to talk to the private people, the public-private entities. And Chile, Argentina, for example, the tourism exchange is enormous. So there is a balance of 3 million Argentinians in Chile, over 2 million Chileans in Argentina, and there's an integration between Uruguay and Brazil, Argentina, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Chile. So we have an intersection that's very powerful, and there is an economy there that generates a lot of jobs and wealth. And I think that this is the motivation and the strength to do something together. I was looking at the study this morning about destination analysis in the American market, how people feel generally there. In the U.S., it's the main feeder towards South America, the U.S., and Americans don't want to travel. So the environment in the last 2 weeks has worsened, especially in places like Austin, Texas, California, New York, Tambaha, even the beaches in Florida. This American market, which is so relevant towards South America, especially Colombia, Ecuador, they're very relevant. And we're going to have a lot of damage. So how do we recover that trust? Well, that requires a marketing plan, perhaps something that's integrated and more individual relations, but there's a possibility to go back and recover that market that's going to be very, very competitive. What are they looking for? First, fair value. So they're looking for price. People are going to be poorer and very sensitive to price. Second, they're going to want something in a more private place, not so massive. So they're going to avoid cruise ships and also the beaches. Mexico, Costa Rica, Panama, Colombia, Cartagena, has Brazil, not to mention. It's an enormous opportunity. So in that sense, we need to understand the American consumer. The European market is going to depend on that air connectivity, and especially the business. But according to the Fortune survey to 500 CEOs, there's 50% that are going to avoid traveling for business because they realize that Zoom and everything else are substitutes, and it's a complement. And of course, there's a threat, at least in the midterm. So we have to create trust zones and Argentina, Brazil, and to align. There's a situation, there's two countries, Argentina, Brazil, with their differences, where all the developments, hotel developments don't have any debt, so they have equity in the restructuring and the reform, and they don't have any debt. On the Pacific side, Chile, Peru, Colombia, they are leveraged, some more, some less, some tremendously. So there's two situations that come up there in regard to how the future or the lack of cash flow is going to play. If there's no pressure with debts, how to negotiate. The banks are going to stay with the buildings, so the more on the Pacific than the Atlantic side, with an additional ingredient, and that's why I'd like to know your opinions. You mentioned Brazil and Argentina with important devaluations because they're living in a situation that's different. They're going to be cheaper, and with a situation in Brazil that's different from everything else. They are practically living from their internal market. So as this moves on, this has always happened, there's not even, or it doesn't make sense to understand the difference between the real and the dollar, because the internal market is so important that it would seem like there's not just winners and losers in terms of owners and etc., but also destinations. I'd like to know your opinion. I don't know, Ricardo, maybe we'd start off with you.
Claro. Bueno,
Yes.
es verdad esta situación
Yes,
de,
it's true.
de,
This situation
de falta de deuda acá en Brasil y Argentina, y por eso mismo no vimos muchas transacciones hoteleras.
When we saw this,
porque no tiene deuda para
no debt for
presión de la deuda, pero también no hay deuda para financiar la compra de hoteles. Entonces, por eso hay mucho poco. Recientemente hicimos la venta del Hotel Hilton acá de São Paulo, una transacción 100% de equity.
Entonces,
Pero la situación está cambiando mucho.
The situation is changing a lot.
Verdad que el cambio,
hubo
una devaluación del cambio de tipo de cambio de Brasil.
Devaluation in the exchange
Pero
rates
por otro lado,
but
la bolsa, el stock
on the other
exchange
hand,
está
the stock
creciendo porque
exchange
hay
is
mucha
growing
plata
because
interna.
there is a lot of internal
Entonces,
money.
y con esto están apareciendo
with this,
los vehículos que
there
serían
are
los similares a los REITs
vehicles
americanos, los
similar
fondos inmobiliarios,
to
que están
the
captando mucha
real
plata
estate
y
funds in
están
the US.
buscando
They're capitalizing a lot of money.
buenos
They
negocios
are
inmobiliarios.
looking for good
No
real estate
solo
business,
en shopping centers y escritorios, pero también
shopping
ahora en
centers, etc.,
hoteles. Entonces,
but also
yo
hotels.
creo que va a haber
So
una movida muy
I think there's going to
interesante
be a
en
very
este aspecto
interesting move in
de
this
cambio
aspect, in the
de
change of
propiedades, de
the
nuevos inversores
new investors
exactamente
and
acá en
change of
Brasil.
ownership here in
Entonces,
Brazil.
hay mucho
So
cambio.
there's a lot of changes,
También la
and
cuestión de la presión de
there's
caja.
also
Algunos
pressure
hoteles
from some
no tiene
hotels,
deuda, pero
cash flows. There's no
también no
debt,
tiene
but
caja para
they
pagar
don't
sus
have any cash
operaciones.
flow for
Entonces,
their
yo
operations.
creo que
So
esto también va
I
a ser un
think that this
catalizador
is going
de
to be a
negocios
catalyst for
muy
businesses,
interesantes.
and that's
Entonces,
very
yo creo
interesting. So I think
que
that
finalmente vamos a ver
finally
algunas oportunidades de
we'll see good
negocios
opportunities
hoteleros
for
muy
business,
interesantes,
because that
no
it's
solo en
very
Brasil y Argentina,
interesting,
pero
not just
también
in
en
Brazil,
Chile
Argentina, but also in Chile
y Perú
and
y países que
Peru and countries that have
financiamiento de las cuentas
financing
privadas. Pero
from
yo creo
private
que va a haber
sources.
muchos negocios
So I think
hoteleros
there's going to be a lot of
interesantes
business,
en los
interesting
próximos
business
meses.
going on
Va a
in the
ser
next
una
few months.
cuestión de
So
necesidad.
it's going to be a matter of need. I totally agree with Ricardo. I think we need to add there the vaccination in Peru, at least. It's going to be a different whole landscape in 8 months from now. And there's a lot of populism. So politically, if there's no stability for an investor to make a decision to come invest in hotels and there is no vaccination, the investor is going to have to rethink in the long term, because the return will not be 6, 7, 8 years as desirable, or 10 years. It could be much longer. So the factor of the vaccine is going to change the speed of the transactions. They have a lot of debt and they have a lot of cash flow issues, and there's not going to be any more remedy but to look for another formula. And there's also going to be opportunities, very interesting opportunities, but I think even for our country, we are still in the eye of the storm. So it's still premature to talk about estimates. I think the landscape is going to be more clear for September, and in the northern hemisphere, to see how it's going to affect us in this hemisphere. Thank you. Let me add, Jazz. I think the reality in Chile, Peru, is more similar to Brazil and Argentina. The hotel projects are financed with a lot of debt percentage. I could say 60, 70%. Many companies in the last years have done this with very low interest rates in the peso and US dollar. It's a very attractive market in Chile, so there's a lot of financing. So hotels have worked relatively well with the bottom line is it's very on the margin because the interest rates and capital is very high. So this is going to make the business be very fragile. Now, in the current situation, the state and the government had good savings and good financing capacity, and we achieved for basically during 6 months to renegotiate with the banks, and some are paying installments. So we have some assistance until the month of December, where the banks are not going to have to face this payment of this installment, always under the expectation that the market will recover in October, November, December. But I have the feeling that, especially in Santiago, there's 17,000 rooms where a third of the clients are foreign. It's going to be very slow. 2021 is going to be slow. So indeed, some hotels need to reconvert, and they realize that they can't operate because they are obsolete, or because they're old buildings, or the management is not professional. So probably one of the winners will be the personal markets. So this will be something key, and they were surviving from these rooms. So a percentage is clear or closer to 70–80%. And this is Santiago. The rest of Chile, I think, that can recover with the domestic market, except in places like I mentioned at the beginning, more tourism like Cusco, San Pedro Atacama. There's going to be a problem, and I think that the area and transactions will be very strong in September. For 12 or 24 months, it's there's going to be consolidations, and there's going to be a lot of assets that will be ending in the hands of the banks.
Sí, yo quería después comentar también esto que
Yes, I wanted to mention, Hernán,
sobre el cambio de uso de
the change of the use of hotels.
Veo que hay una pregunta en el chat también.
There's a question in the chat,
solo comentar un otro cambio
just to mention, there's another change in macroeconomic change in Brazil,
que es la
very
tasa
important,
de
which
interés.
is the interest rate. So
una baja de intereses
we're
muy
in
fuerte.
a lower,
Por la primera vez en la historia, Brasil tiene intereses negativos comparado con la inflación. Entonces, esto también va a motivar mucho la inversión en activos y no más en títulos del Tesoro Público. Y entonces, por eso, esos fondos inmobiliarios, yo creo que van a captar mucha plata porque está muy atractivo, digamos, comparado con lo que se puede ganar en títulos del Tesoro. Entonces, es un cambio también que va a tener un impacto muy grande en la industria.
So this is going to have an impact on the business. Okay, we're in the last 5 minutes of the meeting, and there's some topics in the Andean area. There is an increase of the offering, and it's important. So as you can see, at some point it's linked to existing properties that are not going to be able to continue. So where would that go? What market could there be? There's 2 specific examples here in Lima. I can't mention the name, but it's in the pipeline. But the decision was made to open a market where it was residential for old age, living homes, adults, and we're going to reconvert. It was designed as a hotel, so it's something where we're attacking this, and so we have this type of opportunities, and there's some houses in the Sacred Valley where there is a possibility to, you can do some telework, to be in any country in the world working. Then there was a study that I loved. The desire of many to get out of the urban city is really to live 1 or 2 years outside the city of Lima. So you need, or we need to see, you need to have stable internet, because most of the officers could easily live in their beach homes in the south, but there's a desire to go up to the hills because there's different perception. So there's an effect, and there's contagion, and there's evidence. So the evidence is much less. So there's a positive effect. So there's 2 examples that we're developing. Yes, in the case of Chile, what we're seeing in Santiago, in the center, is there's 4,000 rooms. There's an area with a lot of services. We have the subway. There's a lot of pressure for the multifamily housing model. So we're probably going to talk about that, and therefore some offering will disappear. And something else that's going to happen in Santiago and many other cities is that apartments that were for rent through platforms like Bookings or Airbnb, they haven't had anything in the last 100 days, so they went to longer renting periods. So that offering is going to disappear for a while. And in the business model of Airbnb, they're going to concentrate on the tourism destinations and where there's longer stays, several months at a time. So on the offering side, the informal offering should drop, and they're going to transform. So the existing offering is going to reduce, and the pipeline, the one that were in Buenos Aires or Santiago, in each of these cities, they're going to be the hotels that were already in construction, like Hilton Santiago. There's an Intercontinental in Viña del Mar. So the pipelines that were already without building, of course, are going to have to wait. And so that what Jazz says, we did a survey here in Chile. And one of the things that's going to happen in tourism in general is that people are going to leave the major cities and going to transform the second homes into first homes. And services like the internet, schools, they're going to come afterwards. But nowadays, people are wanting to start anew. And this is going to be the regional trend. And this is going to generate more capacity in the region.
Sí, bueno, ese es otro vantaje de Brasil contra nuestros vecinos, que el ciclo de expansión de oferta ha terminado en 2016 después del Mundial y empezó una crisis en Brasil. Y también hubo un cambio en este modelo de hoteles que ahora es un sector muy regulado por nuestra SAHIC, CDM brasileña. Entonces, tornó menos atractiva a los desarrollistas inmobiliarios. Entonces, hubo una baja y claro, también tuvimos una crisis económica entre 2015 y 2018 muy fuerte. Entonces, el ciclo está muy bajo. No hay un pipeline grande en Brasil.
Large pipeline in Brazil, very low.
No hay nada programado para
there's
São
nothing
Paulo,
scheduled
Rio,
for São Paulo or
São
Rio.
Paulo, nada en
Very
Rio,
little in
nada
São Paulo, nothing in Rio, nothing in Belo Horizonte.
Entonces,
Brasilia.
no vamos a ver un crecimiento de la oferta.
We won't see any growth of the
que va a
offering,
ayudar
but
a salir de esta crisis más
that's going to take us
fácil.
out of this crisis.
Y concuerdo
So,
con Hernán y Yasmine de que
I agree with
va a haber
Hernán and
una
Yasmine
disminución de la
that
oferta.
there's
Muchos
going to be a
hoteles
reduction in the offering.
que
Many
cerraron
hotels
van a buscar
closed,
otro uso.
and
Y los surgimientos de algunos productos inmobiliarios
rise of certain products
que se adaptan muy bien
that are
a hoteles.
adapting,
Por ejemplo, student housing, que es un
like
producto que
student
está
housing, for
creciendo
example,
mundialmente y está entrando en nuestra
worldwide,
región
and it's
también.
entering in our
Entonces,
region too.
convertir un hotel en un
So
student housing
it's
es
converting
muy
hotel and
fácil.
student housing is very
Lo
easy.
mismo con el concepto
Now, the
residencial de
same
los
as the
co-livings,
residential concept,
donde hay las
where
habitaciones son
there's,
chicas y hay
well, the
mucho uso
rooms
de
are
las
small
áreas
and
comunes
a lot of common areas
del
in the
edificio.
hotel, and
Y también un hotel se adapta muy bien a
the
este
hotels
producto.
adapt
Entonces,
very
este
well to
cambio
this. So this
del
change
seguimiento de
of the
co-living y
co-leading
student
follow-up
housing
and
y
student
otros
housing
productos
and other products
puede ser
will
muy para
be
los hoteles que no
very
están bien,
for
pero tiene buena
hotels that
ubicación.
have a good location,
Va a ser una
and
salida muy
it's going to
interesante,
be
mucho
an
más
interesting way out,
interesante de vender un
more
hotel para
interesting
alguien que quiera
than
hacer
to
un
have a
student
hotel
housing,
that
porque
is
alguien que
doing student
eventualmente
housing,
quiera
because
continuar explorando
mainly
como
they
hotel.
would want to
Entonces,
explore as a
es
hotel.
una
So
salida muy interesante
it's an
la
interesting
industria.
way out for the industry. Well, we've exceeded our time, but there was one last question: is will the hotel chains mesh their brands? And something else is the mesh. What we do have today is this is a mesh of the teams. There were large brands that had their own teams for everything. So the strength of the adjustment of the crisis made this that was in brand A or B to have some merge, and this included reducing, and there is a merge. There's a large staff that is applied to the brands, and it had a tremendous cost. Now, everything's going very fast. I don't think they're going to merge the brands. In the strategy, it's going very well, but it's going to be a merge of hotel companies. So, especially regional, domestic, to survive, they have to live, and they could be bought by the large companies. So, companies, but not brands. On another topic, it's been mentioned, is the vaccine. Evidently, the appearance would change, but again, there is a role of this country. It's almost 60% of the product. So this would appear to be more advanced in this process, and I'm talking about Brazil, Ricardo.
Aparentemente sí, porque por detrás de la vacuna están los
in the vaccine, they have the medical labs that are financing the development of the vaccine, and they're going to want to sell their product.
Es un mercado
Brazil, it's a huge market. That's fantastic.
Yo creo que aparentemente por lo menos dos de ellos ya anunciaron
apparently two of them already announced that they are doing some testing,
prontos para arrancar en Brasil.
And they would be ready to start very soon. Also, we have to observe what's going to happen in the European summer. Europe is the first one to open, and they've opened with the exception of Great Britain, but the rest of the countries have opened, and in these days they are opening, many of them, to the international market without quarantine. So this is going to be a huge, and I leave 1 more minute to each one of you, and we are closing. Yasmine. Bootstrap, communication, communicate, digitalize your processes, and always see the glass half full, because in the Peruvian sector, this can achieve great changes. And thanks again, Arturo. Thank you for coordinating this very entertaining SAHIC virtual. I expect your invitation for the SAHIC Live 2021.
And why not for 2020?
Okay, 2020, why not?
Que ya vamos a estar así tan ocupados asesorando a nuestros
Yes, we're going to be very busy helping our clients and in the financial statements. I wanted to add that, as Ricardo said, we have the mixed one in health or sectors in Santiago. We have the Accord chain that is renting the first 2 stories of rooms, and there's an office and a hotel, but very probably we could go from office to a hotel. It's fantastic, you know, we have all the services, spa, restaurants, meeting rooms, etc. So that would be a great way to have some mix for some time, maybe 2 years. And a good message for everyone is that there's an enormous opportunity in South America to see the glass full. How are we facing climate change? Because let's not forget that tourism contributes 7% of the carbon footprint. Without airplanes in the air, there was an impact on climate, on the carbon footprint. So if we reinvent ourselves and reinvent products and a way to be more green, I think we could have a win.
Bueno, dos comentarios finales. Uno,
2 final comments. One,
los lessons que aprendemos con esta crisis.
The lessons that we learned with this crisis.
No es unida,
the industry
por lo menos
is not
no acá en Brasil. La industria de viajes. Hernán
united,
estaba hablando
at least
de
here in Brazil.
Hernán y Yasmine,
we were talking about uniting
promoción de la región.
Maybe a promotion for the region of Brazil, but this is upside down. Internally, you know, the people are working very separately, so it's clear there's a lot to do in the hotel industry and trips, because
la falta de
need to ask for help and the information in the industry. So there's a lot to work on for future crises. And the other is
cambiar la estructura de costo
to change the cost structure for hotels to make them more attractive to the investors.
Aprendemos que hay mucho que se puede hacer.
There's a lot that could be done.
El hotel continúa a funcionar bien.
The hotels continue to work and thank you, Ricardo. Thanks everyone. Yasmine, Hernán, Ricardo. Thank you for participating in this episode 15. I think that it's a tremendous boom of meetings that everyone is having via internet, and the pandemic everywhere in our region, the sanitary crisis and the quarantine was established in March 15th or so. And since then, SAHIC are meeting with all of you online every week, as we will do next week in episode 16. Thanks to the participants in today's panel and everyone joining us in the audience. Thank you.
Gracias, Arturo.
Thank you, Arturo.